Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ryan, and welcome to Central Park. We're happy to continue bringing the park to you through our virtual programs and our in-person programs, but we're very happy to have you continuously join us on our weekly walks, these 30-minute virtual programs every Wednesday at 12:30, covering various topics in the park, ranging from history to landscape to some of my favorite, ecology, covering some of the plants and critters of Central Park. I have a special little walk for you today. We're going to talk about one of our favorite winged companions here in Central Park, a very appropriate walk to take during this month of October. We're going to take a weekly walk titled Bat Walk with me, Ryan, on October 12th, 2022. So thank you everybody for joining us. And thank you for continuing to support us, the Central Park Conservancy, the nonprofit that cares for Central Park, caring for all of its 843 acres, making sure this is a pristine landscape for not only people, but also for bats. We do want to thank you again for helping to preserve and celebrate Central Park with us, making sure it's a sanctuary from the pace and pressures of city life, enhancing the enjoyment and well-being of all. And as we explore the park today and learn a little bit about these winged creatures, we are going to be using Zoom, so please use the chat feature to say hello. If you do have a question, use the Q&A feature, and my colleague Desiree will be on the back end answering any questions you might have. Last thing you'll see pop up throughout the walk are going to be some visitor polls, and I'll launch a simple first one right now, which is, have you spotted a bat specifically in Central Park? And if you have, was it during the day or was that night? So let everybody vote in that for a moment as we start up our walk, this Bat Walk today. And we're going to be exploring a favorite landscape of mine, the Ramble, the second largest woodland in the park. We're going to start over on West 77th Street at an area of the park known as Naturalist Gate. And as we start over here just on the south edge of the Natural History Museum, we're going to appropriately walk into Naturalist Gate. We actually find a statue of somebody hanging out just over here at Naturalist Gate, a very appropriate gentleman to find over here. He was a German polymath, geographer, naturalist, an explorer, a bit of a philosopher, kind of a jack of all trades. His work and research on botanical geography would help to lay the foundation for the field of biogeography, which is basically the study and distribution of species and ecosystems in a geographic area through geological time. A lot of fancy words, but really helping to lay a lot of the initial foundation and work for environmentalism. The gentleman that we're seeing here is Alexander von Humboldt. With some of his work, he really sought to unify and help to unify diverse branches of different scientific knowledge and culture together. This important work would actually help to motivate holistic perception of the universe as one interacting entity, something that I personally always think of, the Gaia theory, that this whole Earth is really just one living, breathing organism. He helped to introduce these concepts of ecology that would actually lead to environmentalism. Actually, something interesting about Humboldt I figured would be appropriate to share is in 1800 and again in 1831, he described scientifically on the basis of observations that were generated during his travels, local impacts of development caused by human-induced climate change. So something that he was actually identifying 200 years ago, or some of the impacts that humans have had on the climate. As we start up our walk, we'll enter at Naturalist Gate, appropriately where we can find Alexander von Humboldt's statue. And as we start diving down into the park a little bit, we're going to hang a left and actually come under the walkway we just started entering into. As we slide down the path a little bit, we'll find a pretty interesting little rustic bridge, one of many that we can find throughout the park, one of many that are also constructed by our crafts team here at the Central Park Conservancy. These rustic bridges really set the scene for the beauty that we can see. And as we look over this specific bridge, we see a small grotto, actually just kind of beyond the tree line. We can catch a little glimpse of Balcony Bridge. We'll actually get a better view of that a little bit later. Today, we see this area kind of just spill out water into the middle of nowhere. The water is coming from the lake, the nearby water body. It kind of just abruptly ends over here. But had we visited this area prior to 1930, we may have seen a site a little similar to this, because at one point, this landscape was actually a pond. It was a small pond, a kind of sub-pond to the lake, as the lake water would spill under Balcony Bridge, creating what was known as Ladies Pond. Ladies Pond was primarily used as an ice skating pond for women, but unfortunately we do see this pond meeting its end. Created to be a more seclusive and private area for women to go ice skating, this was typically probably the scene we would see. Now, I'm unsure if this picture is definitely at Ladies Pond or not. It might just be a section of the lake in the corner, but this is probably what we would have seen prior to the 1930s on Ladies Pond. Plenty of ladies skating here in a little bit more of a private landscape rather than the large and very inclusive lake, which just had tremendous amounts of people. We see these smaller water bodies usually connecting the larger ones, unfortunately being filled in between the 1880s to 1930s. Now there's kind of different words. Some people say that this Ladies Pond was filled in the 1880s, but most information suggests it got filled in around the 1930s. And one of the reasons this pond and a lot of other ponds were filled in is because of a mosquito problem. Mosquitoes breeding in these stagnant and otherwise pretty gross ponds and bodies of water that were left here in the park led to a lot of yellow fever outbreaks, as we see yellow fever and malaria being transported and spread through these mosquitoes, leading to a few of these bodies of water being removed entirely from the park. We won't see these bodies of water anymore, but we can find some more small landscapes that were created as these bodies of water were filled in with earth. Today, they support 20 different school groups in other areas and people that are coming to just rather picnic here in the park. While we can't find that skating pond here anymore, we can still find some other remainders of architecture that existed during the same time. The sun's shining in our eyes. It almost looks like we have a cave just beside us. As we walk a little bit closer, we can see it's not a cave, but it's Eagle Vale Arch, the only double arch that's found here in Central Park. We actually began our walk by walking over this, so we can walk under it now. Fittingly, this is made from the bedrock of New York, Manhattan schist, and just above it is Naturalist Gate. Very appropriate. As we start to walk through this, we may envision what it looked like prior to the 1930s when the ladies' skating pond still existed. That site would have looked a little something like this, seeing that waterway just spill underneath, very similar to Glenspan Arch and Huddlestone Arch up in the north end of the park, that has a little bit of land and a little bit of water passing underneath. This is a really interesting little picture here. It's also pretty interesting because this arch, Eagle Vale Arch, technically started as a bridge since it was going over water, but since it's been filled in, now it's technically an arch. But an interesting shot we can see here from 1880 that was taken by Augustus Hepp, showing again that spillover that leads into the ladies' skating pond that unfortunately is no more. As we continue under this Eagle Vale Arch, though, we can jump back rather to present day time. And even though there's no water feature anymore, it's still a beautiful walk coming under this archway, which always kind of reminds me of a cave here in the park. We can find this pedestrian path being added after this area was filled in. Although it's not a cave, it certainly gives off kind of cave-like vibes. And this is a good spot to kind of introduce some of these stars of our walk today. Now, when we're talking about bats in New York, we'll find 9 different species. We can actually find these species kind of grouped into 2 separate categories. Group 1, which we're starting to see now, are cave bats. Here we can see 3 of the 6 species of cave bats that are found in New York City and New York abroad. These bats can be found really all around New York year long, especially at night. You'll see the northern long-eared bat, the little brown bat, and the Indiana bat. As we move to the next 3 species in this group of cave bats, we can find the last 3 of the 6. As you may have guessed from these bats' names, they do spend a lot of time in caves, but only during the winter months when these species hibernate, surviving off their fatty reserves. During the rest of the years, these bats settle in simple roostings, ranging from buildings to rock crevices to bridges, tree cavities, cracks, or even crevices in the trees. These bats are typically identified by their lack of fur on their tail membranes and overall relatively plainish brown kind of color. Here we can see an eastern pipistrelle, otherwise known as a tricolored bat, a big brown bat, and a small footed bat. As we move a little bit throughout the park, we can talk a little bit more about how these bats interact with their landscape. And although we might not find any true caves in Central Park today, we can still find plenty of areas where these bats spend time. Looking throughout the croppings of rock, much like the ones lying just next to Eagle Vale Arch, we can find small little caverns and crevices, many areas that probably are very appetizing for bats to spend the night. So we can find countless different areas where these cave bats can actually roost. And roost just means basically hanging, resting, sitting on a tree, basically just not flying around. As we continue down a little bit, we're going to start crossing the street and enter into the Ramble, the woodland of Central Park that I think is going to be the best to talk a little bit about bats. As we cross the street, though, I'll end that first poll and share the results. And actually, most people here have not seen a bat in Central Park. I'm sure a lot of people have seen a bat elsewhere. And one thing I actually am interested to see is that of the people that have seen a bat, 10% have seen one at night, which I expected a lot of people to vote for night, but it looks like about 7% of people that voted in this have seen one during the day, which is really rare. Bats are nocturnal, so they're not often active too much during the daytime, but of course it is still possible to spot one if you keep a keen eye. And we'll talk about how and where you could probably spot one as we cross the street and enter the Ramble. But before we do that, we can check out Balcony Bridge. This is what was kind of peeking through the tree line before when we were at that Rustic Bridge. Balcony Bridge spills water from the lake underneath the carriage road that we're walking along, and eventually would take it into the ladies' skating pond. But of course, that's no more, as we've learned. So it does come eventually to an abrupt end near that rustic arch. Balcony Bridge is most appreciated from the lake. It still gives off plenty of beautiful views, even though the water doesn't travel that far underneath it anymore. But we can see again the more appreciative view of Balcony Bridge, which is from the lake, sailing around on one of the rowboats. One interesting thing to point out is that at one point we might have seen a structure nearby here. The structure might have looked something like this. It was known as the Ladies' Cottage, and it served as a rest station for women who could change into their skates and ready themselves for skating on that ladies' skating pond. I'm actually not sure exactly when this structure was lost from the park, but it may explain why another structure exists nearby. If you travel along the west side of the lake, you might happen upon Hearn's Head. Hearn's Head, you'll find a beautiful little pavilion known as Ladies' Pavilion. This was actually once located at Columbus Circle, but it was moved up here to this section of the park once the main monument would be erected in its place in 1913. Perhaps it was moved to this location to honor the Ladies' Cottage that once existed nearby. As we travel away from architecture, we'll trade off some of those buildings and pavilions for my favorite, some towering trees. And as we start to walk into the Ramble a little bit, we can jump back into our subject of bats. Although sometimes described as flying mice, bats are more closely related to primates and humans than they are to rodents. In fact, bats' wings are similar to a human hand. They have 4 fingers and they have thumbs. As we continue into the park, we can get beautiful views that remind us why people and bats love Central Park. Kind of a romantic view here, huh? Bats may feel the same way, considering fall is when bats breed. Although don't expect any babies being born in winter, females actually store sperm in their bodies and fertilize the egg in spring. So we won't see any young bat for a few months. But as we make our way deeper into the park, as we make our way a little bit deeper into the park, we can enjoy again the nice shrouded cover of the Ramble. Young bats are typically born around June or early July, with many flying and hunting within about a month of them actually being born. Although these bats don't often build nests, they do form nursery roosts and colonies, with many females giving birth in the same general area. And one of my favorite facts is that baby bats are known as pups. Pups, as they're called, are cared for only by mama bats, though. As we move a little bit into the park, we can see some of the reasons bats appreciate Central Park. So New York caves and mines are often too cold for raising young, considering the pups are born hairless and weigh about 30% of their mother's weight. These pups do have well-developed feet, though, and can actually start hanging relatively soon after being born. And within about a month, these pups are getting meals for themselves, which is pretty easy to do here in Central Park. As we walk by, we can notice a seemingly unimportant branch sticking out. But as we come a little bit closer, we can notice some of the beauty that exists within here. Branches like the one in front of us have a little hidden secret. They have food on them. Maybe not for us, but insects rather, for bats. Technically arachnids, as we can see a spider web here. Spiders actually aren't insects, but arachnids, a whole separate category. But that's a whole nother talk. What we can see here is, again, another spider web of plentiful available food source for bats. And bats might not super often eat arachnids like spiders, but we do see them eating a lot of other winged pests that we might not like. And we can actually get a little bit of an idea as to why this spider's web is here. Because if we take a moment to look, we can actually see a lot of food flying around. As I play this video, when we look a little bit towards the sun, you might notice all those little specks jumping across the screen. Just an example of the tremendous amount of food that is found here in the park. This is why there are countless spider webs over here, as we see a lot of really insect buffet existing over here. Bats will eat about 20 to 50% of their body weight. And actually, this one is probably a pretty obvious one, but I want to launch a second poll, one that you probably now have the answer for, as I didn't share it a little bit earlier. But we see bats eating about 20 to 50% of their body weight in, drum roll, should be a probably pretty obvious one, insects each night. In fact, 70% of the bats worldwide and all of New York's bats eat flying insects. As we continue, as we continue on our walk, we'll keep walking along the ramble, wandering around, much as this landscape is named for, getting us a little lost and turned around. And as we twist and turn through the park, coming onto some of these more natural wood chip paths, I figure this is a good spot to kind of debunk a little myth we may have heard about bats. So anybody ever heard the expression blind as a bat? Whoever said that clearly doesn't know anything about bats, because contrary to popular belief, most bats see very well, but they are nocturnal, so they hunt at night. Since they hunt at night, vision isn't the most important tool for catching food, but rather hearing is. We see bats relying primarily on echolocation for collecting insects. Echolocation is basically the release of rapid pulses of sound, which are too high for people to hear, and they're emitted by the bat jumping off at about 200 pulses per second. We see these echoes returning to the bat and helping it determine location, size, and shape of the prey. This is why a blind bat has never bumped into you at night, even though it seems like it's a little kind of wobbling all over the place. As we continue down, we can find waterways like these, which do provide areas for insects to breed, giving bats plenty of food to catch using echolocation. But the slow moving water that, of course, we can't notice from a still shot here helps to reduce excessive numbers of mosquitoes breeding here, which typically prefer a more stagnant or still body of water. As we continue through the ramble, we can find all different types of secrets we may not have known existed, like a rustic wooden shelter that exists within the ramble. At one point, 3 of these could be found in just the ramble alone, but today, this will be the only one you find. Being made of wood, many of these require reconstruction every about decade or so, which is why this is the only remaining shelter in the ramble presently. But while the wood experiences natural breakdown, we do see this providing more area for insects to thrive. And of course, more insects means ultimately probably more bats. And who's to say there aren't some winged assassins waiting to just pounce on some tasty insects over here? Because bats aren't the because caves rather aren't the only place we find bats. We can actually find a different group of bats known as tree bats. The other 3 species of bats, again, total of 9 species. We saw before the little brown bat, big brown bat, eastern pipistrelle, or the tricolored bat, Indiana bat, and small-footed bat. Here we can see the other 3, these personally being my 3 favorites, the silver-haired bat, the eastern red bat, and my personal favorite, the hoary bat on the top right. These bats, as their name may imply, roost mostly in and on trees, but unlike cave bats that hibernate in the winter in caves, these bats take a note from migratory birds and they actually head south for the winter, where insect food is more readily available. Often the bats typically return in about mid-April to continue their fun little exploration of parks, cleaning up the insect populations here that we find. Tree bats such as this eastern red bat spotted here in Central Park, a photo taken by Bruce Yolton, be seen hanging on bark in various areas of trees as they roost during the day. Although this one might be easy to spot, they typically blend in very well with their surroundings. And we can take a note from the hoary bat. This is actually a photo of a bat I was able to take in Central Park about 4 years ago. I noticed this bat hanging down near the Dairy Visitor Center. Hoary bats, a favorite of New York's bat species, and the largest that we'll see, prefer to roost traditionally in that upside down hanging style, often found in trees with dense branches. This hoary bat, again, is pretty clear standing out in this photo with all the green leaves. But if we look at, of course, just any old shrubby hedge in the park, we'll find a lot of dead leaves covering up the sign of potentially a snoozing bat. So looking in the view like this, it becomes much more difficult to differentiate one of those roosting bats from just a clump of dead tree leaves, which is why spotting a bat during the day is very difficult, but of course not impossible. This is a great example of a comparison again, as we look at that hoary bat doing a very good dead leaf impression right here. As we continue on through the park, we can also find other areas that bats may be hanging out, but maybe ones that are less visible. The ramble provide a lot of opportunities for these birds, or for these winged mammals. Standing dead trees known as snags provide a lot of environmental benefit. Snags like this one, which we can see here, can be used for shelters for various species of bats. Both tree roosting bats and cave bats can utilize structures like these to roost for the day, as well as even maybe taking a break during nighttime. We also see insects coming from this, providing almost like a delivery of food right to your door. As we continue walking a little bit more through the ramble, we can make our way to one more location on our walk today. And as we walk over again, we can just appreciate a little bit more about these winged beauties. Bats are actually the only true mammal, or only true flying mammal in the entire world. Flying squirrels, some people may be saying, well, that's a mammal. Flying squirrels actually don't fly, they just glide. So bats are truly the only flying mammal you'll find. Really cool little fact about these interesting little insect removers. As we wander a little bit more through the ramble, we'll take a nice long stroll, making our way to our final location where we can talk a little bit more about bats. And as we make our way through the park, we can enjoy some of the sunlight that's shining on us. Knowing that the sunlight is not going to last too long, as the days are already getting so much shorter, we're soon approaching a very different looking type of ramble, one that just in a few months, probably even less than that, will start to look like this, a snow-covered winter wonderland. And during the winter time, of course, we do see a lot of these cave bats going into hibernation. And by this time, a lot of migratory tree bats making their way down to South America. But of course, as we know, weather is constantly changing. We do see a lot of different effects in climate change affecting basically weather patterns that the park is experiencing. Oftentimes, we may even see some early frosts or early snows that come a little bit more unexpected. Many of those all the trees, bats we mentioned, the silver-haired bat, the hoary bat, and the eastern red bat, which is pictured here, all migrate as winter approaches. But of course, again, these unpredictable conditions sometimes can create early frost or even snowstorms that might create a lack of food or force these animals to really adapt to the new temperatures that are rolling in. This bat that we see here actually is using a really amazing adaptation that these bats have. Bats have a solution if they're met with an early frost or early snowstorm they're not expecting. It's called torpor. Hibernation is extended and lasts throughout the winter. Torpor, it's sort of like a mini hibernation that can allow really an animal to enter a hibernation-like state for a shortened amount of time. During this state, the animal will have a slowed metabolism and slower rate of activity, looking very lethargic and using minimal energy, as minimal energy as possible. We often see these bats hanging along a tree, but sometimes we see them just kind of even sitting on the ground. This was actually a bat that I had the pleasure of spotting here in Central Park about 2 or 3 years ago in the Northwoods. This one was actually just kind of hanging in the middle of a wood chip trail. We were able to slide him off a little bit and give him a little bit more cover. But this bat experiencing torpor, going through again that kind of hibernation-like state just for a short period, while that early frost and early small snowfall came through. allowing that bat to pick it up once the weather's a little bit warmer and probably start migrating. But a fun little sighting to see in the park. And again, look in the trees, look in the dead leaves, look on the ground. You never know where you're going to find a bat. As we continue around, we'll come to our final stop on the walk today, wrapping up the hill and certainly getting a little bit of exercise in. As we walk a little bit towards the west, we can follow this railing up, leading us towards our final location, leading us a little bit into the sunnier landscapes, one that overlooks a nice little bay of the lake. Here we can see a shallow little bay that most people aren't aware of. This little bay, which is most appreciated from, of course, a rowboat rather than up top here, actually has a secret nearby. What we can find in this general location is actually a cave. There's a cave right here in Central Park. Well, or scratch that. There was a cave in Central Park. Although it's not accessible for the public today, there was once a cave in the Ramble that visitors were able to go inside to. We would unfortunately see this being sealed off by the 20th century. But it may have been a perfect place for some bats to roost during the day. As we saw, though, we can still find plenty of crevices for these bats to hang out. One thing to think about, though, is even if this cave wasn't sealed off, we still likely wouldn't be able to go in it. And the reason is not one that you may think. What we can see here is an unfortunate picture. The reason we probably wouldn't be able to go into caves like that, even if they were open, is something called white nose syndrome. This is a fungal disease that has been spreading across North America from Albany, New York, since the winter of 2006 to 2007. This fungal disease has killed millions of bats, devastating 90 to 100% of some populations. The disease is a complex one, but to put it simply, like many problems, it's spread by us. People often contract a disease around, and this one, white nose syndrome, has been spreading a lot of times from people visiting parks, other natural areas, and basically spreading around on the bottom of their shoes. You don't realize you're walking on fungal spores. As you enter caves and other areas that are lesser visited, you travel and you spread these around. Visiting caves and other areas where bats are nesting, we see these spores and fungus being spread on shoes, clothing, transported on various other human materials, and eventually taking it to areas it wouldn't naturally get to. This has led to the closure of many caves throughout various national parks, like the Smoky Mountains used to be able to go into a few caves. But we do see these all being closed now because of this white nose syndrome, which has been devastating bat populations all across the United States. We can actually see a photo here of, unfortunately, a bat that is no longer alive due to white nose syndrome, which this fungus just completely overwhelms their nose, eyes, mouth parts, and really, of course, prevents the bat from being able to see, hear, breathe, eat, or really do anything. So this is something that we do want to watch out for, because while this disease is a devastating one for bat population, it serves as a stern reminder of our effects on the natural world. It also serves as a friendly reminder that the rules for visiting parks and natural areas are there for a reason. You might see the signs: please keep your dog on a leash when you're in the woodlands. Please don't walk over the small fences. Please stay out of these areas. Those are often all put up for a reason. It's not that we don't want you to see the full extent of an area's natural beauty. We just want to make sure that there continues to be natural beauty for all to see. So to learn more about bats, white nose syndrome, and bats in Central Park, you can check the chat for links providing some information on this, ranging from articles by us here at the Central Park Conservancy on bats' interaction with the park, of course, some information from park departments and the DEC on the bat species you can find here in New York, as well as, again, some information on white nose syndrome, some FAQs on that, as well as some things that you can do to help prevent that spread, and of course, keep bats healthy and going. And we can, of course, see plenty of bats here in the park. A few of the photos that I found of bats myself, as well as a few photos provided by Bruce Yalton, like this one we can see here, of a very beautiful eastern red bat roosting next to a beautiful little flower. But as we end our walk, I do want to thank you for joining us and supporting the wildlife of Central Park. And again, thank you for helping to keep the park healthy, following the rules that are in place for a reason to help keep these animals thriving and to keep their habitat thriving well. As we do come to the end of the walk, this is a little bit of the confusing route we we wandered around today. But as you do travel into the park, you can find bats anywhere, whether it be in the park or out of the park. Once it comes to dusk, just look up and you'll probably see a few bats reducing those mosquitoes that are flying just overhead. So as we do come to the end of our walk, I do want to again thank you for joining us and supporting bats and the Central Park Conservancy. I'm going to be leaving this room open for a little bit longer to answer any questions we may have not had time to get to. But otherwise, I do want to thank you all for joining us and urge you to come on more programs, both virtual and in person. Of course, you can find the information for those on our website, centralparknyc.org. But for all of us here at the Central Park Conservancy, thank you so much for joining us. Till next time, stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Bye, everybody.